even in consulting and the same thing in IT, like for me, the win is if I can get the other person to agree to my idea, but think it was their idea.
And so like when you're interacting with someone else, like that empathy of trying to put yourself in their position, like they may be having a completely different emotional response. Like you have this brilliant idea and all they see is threats.
I want to learn and grow from my team as well as much as I want to, influence and impact their growth.
I think it does stop a lot of people from learning new things, is this sort of fear of going back to zero.
So I think that ability to let go, and I think critical for leaders, you want to then hire people who are smarter than you in those subject areas. If I'm walking into the room and I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room.
All right, well, I'm here with Noni Azhar, IT leader and a man who's had a huge and fantastical career. So I'm super excited to dive in and learn a little bit more about you and how you went down the path that you did. To start with, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got in the chair that you're in right now? Tell me a little bit about how you got into IT in the first place and sort of like what stepping stones led you along the path.
Matt, thank you for having me. Excited to be chatting with you. From an early kind of when I started my career, I was always fascinated to solve the people, process, technology, triangle, puzzle, whatever we want to call it. But that always fascinated me. And I think I always wanted to be in a role where I'm kind of, solving across all those three vectors, if you will. Started off kind of my background is in computer science, computer engineering, started off as a developer, but jumped at the first opportunity I got to go into technical consulting in the CRM space. Again, kind of I was able to do the solving technical problems, making sure the business needs and processes are being kind of fulfilled and met, and doing it at the end kind of with the backdrop of keeping in mind what's the impact on people. And that really kind of, was there for over a decade and really enjoyed that. I think for me, kind of a couple of things. One, I was like, kind of when I'm done, I kind of wipe my hands clean. What's the end result? Like, what did we learn? Like, are they actually using the product or not? And to me, that kind of was always on the back of my mind. And then I'm a huge sports fan, and I started kind of feeling like I was doing things for another team and not my team, if you will. And then also kind of in my career, like in consulting, it was those IT people that would come in at the end and ask what I perceived at that time as the hard questions. Like everybody else has said yes, and now these IT people show up and asking me all these kind of technical system integration, scalability questions. I was like, I want to go in and kind of go infiltrate and know what it's about and run it from the other side, if you will, and kind of started exploring and had an opportunity to lead the applications team at SugarCRM. Matt, a month in, and I was like, I found my home because I got to exercise the people, process, technology, kind of the variety that entailed. Got to take the learnings, both the positive as well as kind of the growth in terms of like seeing the end result of projects, initiatives, and really again felt like I was doing it for my team. The hard thing I must say though was like, when I was doing in consulting and charging for my opinion, everybody agreed with it. Now that I was internal and doing it for free, everybody questioned it left, right, and center. But I think to me, like that's kind of where like the variety, solving across the people, process, technology, triangle, and doing it for my company, my team, that really kind of like made me find my home in IT and kind of build my career there.
Very cool. I want to dive in on a couple places. And one of the things that I'm so interested about, and we've done a number of these now, where you talk to IT people, and particularly when you're talking through the career, people come up again and again, right? I mean, and at the end of the day, like it does really seem like it's ironic that IT is really just, it's a people business. So I'm super curious when you think about like having to build the skills to sort of convince a business to do a thing or to bring a team along or something like this. Like, can you walk me through like the aha you had along that way? Like was there a particular situation where you're like, this is not going the way I need it to go and I'm going to need to get better at this skill? Or how did you build that skill? Because it's not an inbuilt thing. You have to kind of tune it.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's looking at things from the other side of the board, if you will. And I kind of grew up playing chess, and I think that really helped in terms of like, you're seeing things from your side. And even though, using the chess analogy, it's the same pieces, same board, but the view is different if you look at it from the other side. And I think for me, like early in my career, especially kind of once I started in leadership and people management, it was like, let me understand the other person's perspective, if you will. Where are they coming from, right? And I think that really helped in terms of convincing. And like, even in consulting and the same thing in IT, like for me, the win is if I can get the other person to agree to my idea, but think it was their idea. Like that's the huge win-win, right?
Inception. Yeah, the inception
Exactly,
moment, right? Yeah.
exactly, right? Like, but I think it's really comes from like understanding where the other person is coming from their vantage point, where they're at, what's kind of driving. Because it's like not so much what they're saying, but what they're not saying. I think is critical to understand. And I think to me, again, like I think part of that, like I grew up on the East Coast up until sixth grade. I did a different school. This is pre-social media, by the way. So it was like had to make friends like
Oh, yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but I think it taught me life lessons both personally and professionally in terms of connecting with people. And I think it's super critical to connect with people. And I think it's not a moment in time. It's something to keep building and keep kind of growing. And I think that is super critical in terms of being able to convince. And exactly like you said, like it's from an inception perspective, the idea people think they're going to be more behind the idea if they think this was something that they came up with, their idea. And you're just kind of nudging and guiding them to kind of that conclusion and making sure you have the right guardrails, if you will, so that we don't go off rails, right?
As a side note, I spend a whole bunch of my time in cybersecurity and like doing things like, working with incident responders and stuff like this. And one of the big lessons that I learned pretty early on was like your day may be vastly different than your customer's day, And so like when you're interacting with someone else, like that empathy of trying to put yourself in their position, like they may be having a completely different emotional response. Like you have this brilliant idea and all they see is threats, something like that. Right. And so like there very much is this empathy, which doesn't, curiously, come naturally to a lot of people who pick computers as a first career. So like, having to build that out.
And I think that's where it's critical, right? Like, I think it's like the customer service approach. Like even in IT, it's like your customers may be internal, but having that customer service approach, I think, is critical. And to your point about empathy, I think COVID really taught us that because it's not just professional, right? People may be having a bad day personal, and when professional and personal lines blended so much, I think that empathy becomes super critical. Kind of understanding that. So totally agree with that.
Oh. Now, my sense is that there's a couple of big kind of career transitions, and having gone through a number of these myself, like I'm basing this a little bit on my experience and then just on sort of like lived experience of a bunch of people I've talked to, where you start out, you're an individual contributor, and so you have a certain set of skills and things like this, and then you end up being a manager, and all of a sudden there's like this step change in what you're doing, what you're working on, tools change, this sort of stuff, and then like at least my perspective is like become a director or a VP. There's like another step change. And then there's a whole nother one when you become kind of a C-level executive. So I'm kind of curious, one, has that been your experience? And two, if it was, like, what are some of the shocks along the way? Are there things that if you were talking to a younger you'd be like, you're not going to believe this, but
Right. You're spot on. I think like definitely, I think when you start as an IC, it's kind of more depth versus breadth. And I think as you kind of go to exactly you said that, like, first manager, kind of first level manager, people manager role, you have more breadth, whether it's, influence in terms of like you're managing people, but also like you would be beyond like just what your initial scope of responsibility was as an IC. And I think adjusting to that where you still kind of have to have your core expertise, if you will, as far as the depth, but adding the breadth and kind of what's that mix of breadth and depth. I think that's definitely a step like so that you have to learn. Managing people are not just responsible for your work, you're responsible and accountable for your team's work and how you adjust to that. I think that's super critical. And then I think the director level is definitely that step function. And I think the biggest thing about the director level is you're kind of being pulled in two directions. You still have to be close to the weeds. You still have to be hands-on, if you will, be able to kind of resolve and kind of pinch hit for your team members where and when needed. But you're looked at to kind of provide that strategic kind of thought leadership. How are you providing strategy? How are you thinking about the long, medium term plan? And I think that's a more of a tussle that you have to kind of get used to, get comfortable, and grow into. I think that's definitely the case. And then to your point, I think once you're kind of VP and above, I think that's where you're kind of more focused on the strategy. And I think it's like letting go, right? And I think where you have to let go, and I think you no longer the subject matter expert in whatever two or three areas that you thought you were, you were
yeah,
it, right? Like you knew everything. So I think that ability to let go, and I think critical for leaders, you want to then hire people who are smarter than you in those subject areas. And I think those are the two critical things that I think are critical as you kind of grow into that. And then kind of thinking beyond your kind of scope of influence or remit and responsibility as you're an executive VP and above, you're thinking even more about the company. What is the impact on the company, and wearing that, even more of that company hat, if you will, and having those conversations, being in those conversations, which, you may not have had that much experience in like sales numbers and marketing leads being in IT, but you gotta have an opinion and you gotta have like, thought there. And I think that's super exciting. And I think for me, like I love variety. Like I think maybe I get easily bored. I think the variety element has always kind of kept me going and kept me motivated. Um, Advice to my younger self, I think, is like, just be compassionate with yourself. I think like that is the biggest thing, right? I think early on, it was kind of right. Like when you take on new skills, you're like, wait, why don't I know this as well? Again, I grew
Oh,
up in the
okay. Yeah.
CRM
Yeah.
space and I was like, I know CRM really well. Now, Workday it's an application. It should be the same as Salesforce, but it's not, right? Like, I think that's the security is a whole different animal, right? I think that's the thing that I think just being more compassionate and going through those steps of learning at the pace that because it's going to be different in different areas, right? Like there are
Mhm.
certain things that are going to come more naturally to you. There's certain things that are going to take a more time, and I think that compassion, I think, is key.
I think so. It's fascinating because again, back to the sort of like it comes down to humans and emotions and things like this. Is this idea like I think it does stop a lot of people from learning new things? Is this sort of fear of being going back to zero or something like this, right? And like compassion for yourself and sort of like giving yourself the space to be like I'm gonna try this new thing. I'm gonna be terrible at it. One of the things that was interesting, I got to work for a guy who was a mentor of mine for years and years, and one of the things he used to say was like when somebody became a new manager they were going to be a terrible manager for like a year or two. I mean, it was just like they're just learning a new thing and they're going to do it badly. And like you have to give them some space to struggle. You can't let it really impact the organization, but you have to. And I watched so many people make that initial transition from like IC to manager, thinking they were going to be just as good. They were just going to, it was just a horizontal move. I'm going to come in and it didn't work out that way, right? And like a lot of them struggled, and so that idea of being able to sit down and be like, yeah, it's hard, and you're gonna get better at it. I think the same thing happens up that executive chain as well. So I am curious when you think about like maybe back to the first team you led or leading teams, building the environment where you can allow people to be compassionate with themselves, or building an environment that like prioritizes learning and customer focus and stuff like this. How have you done that? How have you approached that? Because not every team is like that. I've worked for teams that are like, oh no, there's a bottom line, and if you're not helping me achieve it, like you're gone. How did you do that?
Yeah, I think key things about how, and I honestly, I don't know how to operate otherwise, is like you got to be authentic, you got to be yourself, because honestly, that's what you're going to be best at. You can't pretend to be somebody you're not,
Mm.
and empathy, right? Like understand where people are, meet people where they're at, and I think then kind of my non-negotiables are like directness and transparency. Both ways. Like I want to learn and grow from my team as well as much as I want to, you know, influence and impact their growth. And I think that having those open channels where people are not walking on eggshells. Like I always say, like, if I'm walking into the room and I'm the smartest room person in the room, I'm in the wrong room, right? And I also say, like, we're not going to walk on eggshells because I'm going to make the most mistakes. We're going to learn from each other's mistakes. And I think that creating that space where people are not afraid to move the needle, challenge them, like not be afraid to make mistakes is critical. And I joke, I'm saying I like to say is like make unique mistakes, right? Like let's learn from each other's mistakes. Let's not make the same mistake in the team again and again. But I think that's critical. Empowering team members. I think that is super critical. Where people feel empowered to do their best work. And like finding out what it is that makes people kind of tick, what is it that makes them motivated, what are their skills, and really spending that time with them, I think is critical. And it's not a one-time event. It's a constant,
Mm.
right? As,
Yeah.
as we were kind of talking, people are going to have good days and bad days. So again, I'd summarize with like having like directness, transparency, creating an open, safe space where people are not afraid to make mistakes, but learn from those mistakes, learn from each other, and can really do innovative work where they're not afraid to move the needle and challenge status quo by trying different things and seeing what sticks and what doesn't stick. And I think that's super critical. And then at the end of the day, right? Like again, it's like we all want success. We're all on the same team. Let's kind of win together. Let's, from our failures, let's kind of bounce back stronger and higher and learn from that. I think that's super critical in terms of how I operated.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And one of the things, I mean, what I hear running through a lot of that is like, as a manager in particular, when you're leading a team, you are like, you're not the center of your team. You know, you've got to be you're enabling a bunch of people, but you're not the star of the show anymore, right? You got to let these folks, blossom, and a lot of your job becomes sort of enablement. And that back to that point about like the idea that like a lot of times ICs will go into management because they're like, well, I get to tell people what to do. You know, it's like that illusion lasts for a minute or two, and then they realize, oh my god, this is going to be really hard work, and it's I've got to spend a bunch of time talking about developing people's careers and stuff like that. So that makes sense.
And then the best leaders I've had in my team, and I can think of a couple, they didn't want to be people managers, right? They
Mhm.
wanted their growth. And I think that's honestly, I feel like those are where some of the great leaders come from, is where they're just looking for growth. They're just looking to learn more. They're looking to contribute more. And I think the kind of people management going up the career ladder comes as a byproduct of that growth and learning.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I mean, I think like I too have seen like the best managers I've had in particular, but the best leaders I've had as well have been fundamentally curious people. And so they've been constantly wanting to better themselves, but they're also curious about other people and like, what do you need and what's going on and that sort of stuff. I literally just listened to the Simon Sinek story about like, like what good management is. And fundamentally it's about like, we exist to enable other people to achieve. So knowing more about those people and being curious about like, okay, what are the struggles? Why is it hard? Okay, let's see if we can solve that is super interesting.
And I think just on one point on that, Matt, I think exactly what we're talking. It's a constant. It's not when something goes wrong, then you kind of have like, hey, I'm curious to help. It should be a constant, because I think that's where, again, then it's authentic, then it's empathetic. And then when the incident happens or there's an outage or a mistake was made, you're able to have a conversation and
Yeah.
people don't feel like they know it's genuine, right?
Now, do you think one of the things I've been like reasoning about, and I actually ended up I read a couple of things. Rand's in Repose. He's a management. He does engineering management, writes all the really good stuff. But one of the things that he was sort of talking about, sort of the hierarchy of these things, and like that at a manager level, that all makes sense. At a leadership level, one of the things that rattles around in my head is something I heard many years ago. A guy told me that one of his CEO at a big company they worked at one point told him, look, like at the end of the day, every employee in this company is going to have about 30 seconds to interact with me. And that 30 seconds is going to make or break that thing. So I better be good. You know what I mean? And so there's this dynamic that becomes sort of like you've got to kind of up the kindness dynamic as you go up the ladder, because the impact you can have, the blast radius you can have is just so much more. And so you've got to like really be, kind of conscious of this. It's a little less consistent, a little bit more kind of episodic. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's one of the things most of the really great leaders I've worked with have actually been sort of deeply caring, pretty kind people. Like when you get down to it, like many of them were also incredibly rough people. So it's not all one thing or the other, I guess.
Yeah, I 100%. I think it's like, again, because I think that those are qualities that cannot be taught, right? Like you can take technical trainings, like if people are good people at their core and really care and are curious, each person's going to have a different style. Like I've had some really great managers and mentors who are really caring, like some of the best people that I've ever had gotten the pleasure of knowing, but they're tough and they're direct and they'll
Mm,
let you know, right? But I think I've always appreciated that, because again, I think feedback is a gift, right? Like, and
yeah.
what you do with it is up to you. But I think, kind of coming to your point, I think it's critical that you don't skip the steps on that upward journey. I think that's critical when you get there, like, and you have that 30-second where you're going to make an impact. If you haven't skipped the steps, the velocity and the pace at which people go can be different, but don't skip the steps, because then you'll know and you've built enough of that breadth and depth and have had life experiences that and you understand what's important for again, seeing it from the CEO's perspective, or whoever you meet, to be able to be like, okay, these 30 seconds, this is what's going to be like the most impactful. This is what the person would want to know given what I'm working on. I think then again, that's critical, where you've kind of, you know, again, had the battle scars, and my kids have the silver and lost all their hair in terms of the style, in the steps in the process, right?
Well, look, I mean, I always joke with people that like, this gray hair, like I get this out of a can, like I actually earned every bit of it, right? Uh, so I want to potentially inarticulately pivot a bit, because like we're on a podcast in sort of like current day, and so I think we're going to be a little bit it's going to be important for us to mention AI. I think I'm almost legally obligated in some states to mention AI because we're on a podcast. And so I'm curious, like one thing is, in IT, like talking about AI is all the rage. I'm kind of curious from your perspective. You've been around for a long time, as we mentioned, you've got the gray hair to prove it. I'm curious, when you're thinking about uh, AI, are you thinking that this is a sort of a step change? Is this like, hey, this changes the whole game? Or is this more of like, well, we've seen innovation before, we'll see more innovation in the future? Like, how are you thinking about
Yeah, I think firstly, what an exciting time to be alive, right? I think it's definitely exciting AI, like both the positives and kind of the unknowns. I think it's definitely exciting. I think it's a bit of both, right? I think it's definitely exciting. I think it is unique in terms of what the possibilities are with AI and where we can go. Um, but in some cases, the same as like the dot com bubble, right? Like the digital transformation, cloud transformation. I think it's a similar script. I think the key difference though is like at least from an IT technology perspective, the destination seems less known, if you will, right? Like if I think about cloud and digital, you knew like, we're moving from on-prem to tools like Salesforce, Workday in the cloud. You knew how we get to the destination was maybe, unknown and had to be kind of that path had to be kind of charted out, but you knew where the destination was like early on. And I think in the AI world, there's so many players, so many platforms that are kind of coming up with they have to, right? To your point, right? Like everybody has to be talking about AI. Everybody has to have an AI solution. I think that destination is a little less clear than what it was in the digital transformation or the cloud move. But I think it's exciting, right? Like that's the exciting piece where, as you can have a influence in terms of from a technology IT perspective, figure out that as the vendors and tools and software kind of are figuring out, you can kind of chart that out and figure it out amongst the ambiguity, if you will.
Mhm. Well, I'm curious about the following because I think you're right, and I think like we both lived through sort of the dot com and the sort of the early internet boom. And one of the things I think was so fascinating about that was like what it did was it fundamentally changed the costs of certain things, right? It changed the cost of communication, like one, right? And so it also changed like the cost of basically building larger organizations because a lot of the friction that kept that happening was that. But like other things, the cost didn't shift. So one of the examples I always use for people is like, okay, pets.com. Like we all remember that. And like shipping dog food's really, really expensive. And so pets.com went out of business. The internet made it easy to go order dog food. It didn't make it easy to ship it, right? But now we have like, there's a company called Chewy that is basically like, they do the same thing. They have like pet food on demand, this kind of thing. The reason is because a whole bunch of other infrastructure kind of caught up, like shipping and receiving and stuff like this, like operations, like kind of caught up. One of the things I'm interested in is like how AI, like what costs AI is shifting kind of fundamentally. And so one of the things I'm super interested in is like, what do you think the IT team of the future really looks like? Like, because I keep hearing we're firing all the entry level employees and like, yeah, it's going to be like 7 old people and like a whole bunch of AI. Like, what's your head telling you about that?
Yeah, I think firstly, change is a constant, right? And I think you want to kind of proactively adjust to the change. I think it is going to be a different kind of mix, if you will. The skill sets are going to be different. But we've gone through this before as well. I think the key thing is like adjusting and not kind of being naive and not changing the course, if you will. I think like again, we had automation, right? Like with cloud and digital transformation, we had a lot of automation that was kind of built. You had integration platforms that kind of integrated and stitched these different cloud systems together. I think with AI, right? Like if you think about it from an automation theme, I think the key thing is like it's more augmentation, if you will. How is AI augmenting work? And I think that's the key thing. And I think from a resource and people perspective, we all have to kind of adjust in terms of how does AI augment our work? How does it up level whatever work that we're doing? Now, there's always going to be the boring, mundane work that needs to get done. Can we automate that through AI, right? Like from an IT perspective, right? Like login password resets, right? Can we just automate that? Right. Like I think that now that would free up 30 to 50% of like IT help desk resources
Yeah,
time to focus on more value add stuff, right?
yeah.
I think that's kind of just an example in terms of how do we adjust? How do we make sure that we are not replacing people, we're up leveling people. And then I think the key thing is the workforce, the new workforce that's entering, coming with the right skills. I think that's where the entry level skills, right? Like when you and I kind of entered, it was a different level of entry level skills because that was the need of the hour and the day. I think that's where AI is making an impact, and that's kind of where we have to adjust, right? Like not kind of this drastic kind of doom and gloom that it's going to take over all jobs. No, it's automating jobs, just like digital cloud transformation did that, and it's a matter of adjusting to that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like I will tell you, like if you read enough articles on LinkedIn, you end up it's going to be a post-apocalyptic hellscape dotted by fuel-starved mutants, and like we're all going to be just like living in the Road Warrior, right? But like you're absolutely like. Then I talk to people and they're like, well, hang on a second, like the entry level jobs that you and I had don't even exist anymore, right? Like they're like, no one does those, but you also wouldn't want to do them now. That's the thing. They're talking to another leader and they said that. I'm like, yeah, that does make some sense. I am really interested though in how close working with the agentic, the large language model, the chat-based agentic technologies, how close that really is to management. So back to that thing, a little less on the emotional side, but very much on the, can I summarize an objective in a way that can then be understood, and then can I evaluate a result? And those are actually fundamentally management skills. So I think we may actually need to up-level everybody into, being managers of a fleet of little robots or something like this, as a kind of a thing.
And I think that's where really the most successful people, I think, in all these transformations have been the curious, those that want to learn and grow. I think that's not going to change with AI, right?
Yeah. Well, and I do think you're absolutely right. And I think one of the things that will end up happening is like, no one will know where it's going to go. Like, and that's part of the thing, is like, just literally no one. And my experience like tells me that the more forcefully somebody tells me they know where it's going to go, the less they probably have a handle on where it's going to go.
100%.
Is the general thing. Yeah. So fair enough. So I want to ask a final question, which is, hey, so like, all right, we're talking to sort of like folks who are just starting out, maybe in IT as a career, they're interested in getting there. Like, if there was one resource you were going to point them at and say, like, hey, I want you to go look at this, or it's a blog or a podcast or some advice you give them on what they should do to kind of level up, what would you say?
Yeah, I think definitely like wherever you can learn, wherever you consume knowledge and information, always kind of learn, whether it's like blogs, podcasts. I think those are critical books. I think like mentorship is super critical, right? Like finding people who've kind of boldly gone where you want to go. And I think I definitely have benefited from some great mentorship, and leaders still continue to do so, right? I think that's super critical. Building that peer network, right? Of your peers, where people kind of, because honestly, right, like that, there's book knowledge and then there's practical knowledge. And I think that practical knowledge is super critical to kind of gain that and get it early, right? Like even from what we were talking about, people leadership, or as you're growing technical skills, if you can talk to people who've already done that, you're going to have a leg up in terms of like how you grow and get that skill. So again, I would say like get that mentorship from people who've kind of been there where you want to get to, build that network of peers and people who are kind of solving similar problems. Especially, I think, in coming back to the AI world, I think it's even more critical where the destination is unknown, that you kind of build that network. And it also gets a different kind of outside in perspective, if you will, where you're not just kind of an echo chamber and hearing the same things at your company or your place of work. You're getting those different opinions and variety of opinions that you can then kind of stitch together the picture that will kind of make most sense for you and where you want to go in your career.
Yeah, it's super useful. I have to say, like that, from my perspective, I can count the sort of the mentors I've had in my career, and sort of the turbocharging that they provided, because you do get that extra perspective, but you also get like, hey, like, they've done it before. So like maybe there's a cheat code here that you could just be, oh, don't do that, do this instead, that kind of thing, which is always super awesome.
And I think, again, just like, again, using sports, like the best coaches are not the ones that are just going to always tell you, hey, you're so great, right? Like mentors who tell you what you need to hear, right? Like both what you're doing well and where you need to kind of step up and grow. And I think that's critical.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. Well, I want to say thank you so much for visiting us with us. I really appreciate it. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Matt. Really enjoyed it.